Hey folks, so today we're going to talk about the overlap between ADHD and autism or AuDHD. And this one is a bit personal because this is kind of talking about my journey. So, what does being AuDHD mean? Well, it means that you have both autism and ADHD. And prior to 2013, according to the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual that North America uses to kind of categorize mental health, you were not able to be diagnosed with both. It was one or the other. It was either ADHD or autism. And if you were kind of more what was termed high functioning, you were often more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than with autism because of stigmas and ideas around what autism means. But here's the thing: the more that we get to know and understand neurodivergence, so ADHD, autism, and both, um, the more we understand that there's the comorbidity between the two is actually very high. Statistics disagree, as it often does with something like this, but it says that there's something between either a 30 to 80% overlap a between ADHD and autism, and that seems like a very wide range. It is. We still need more research and study, and I'm not going to lie, given the current political climate in the US, um, I can understand why people aren't necessarily lining up to get diagnoses or to disclose their diagnoses. So, it probably is going to put a bit of a stop or slowdown in the research. That being said, one of the things to understand is that often one diagnosis often hides the other. And so, as an example, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And so, when I started to kind of learn as much as I could about ADHD, I realized there was about 20 to 30% that ADHD didn't kind of fully explain about kind of my experience and what I was going through. And so, the more that I learned about my ADHD and the more I understood it, the more I got it under control. Um, the more I realized that there was pieces that weren't quite connecting that didn't make sense, and so I learned about autism as well, and that was where I was like, okay, that's the missing like 20 to 30. That is the missing 20 to 30%. Um, so many people discover that they're ADHD after they receive kind of their first diagnosis, which usually is ADHD, just because clinically that seems to be kind of the easier one to diagnose. I don't think it actually is. I think it's because there's a lot of misunderstanding around what autism is and what it looks like and how it presents. Again, we're getting better with it, but it is still very much there, more so than ADHD, which is why ADHD does tend to be diagnosed or assessed and diagnosed more so or faster than autism. So, um, so here's the thing: ADHD and autism have a ton of traits that overlap, which is also why it can be very hard to distinguish whether this is ADHD or autism or both, because there are so many traits that overlap. So things like executive functioning, so struggles with planning, starting, finishing tasks, sensory sensitivities. We used to think that this was more an autistic thing, and we're realizing it's also an ADHD thing. Now, think that autism still kind of has the edge in that, more so, but it does affect people that only have ADHD. So being easily overwhelmed by like noise, textures, lights, sounds, smells, things like that. Social fatigue, needing recovery time after social interactions. Again, for kind of different reasons, but is something that kind of both conditions have. Hyperfocus, so kind of a deep, intense interest in certain topics or activities. Again, there's a difference between kind of like hyperfocus versus a special interest. Kind of get into that a little bit. Emotional dysregulation, so kind of big feelings that come on fast and strong, or not really kind of feeling anything, or like big fluctuations. Um, Sometimes not understanding your emotions um, can also happen. Difficulty with transitions, so needing extra time or predictability. So I used to think like With ADHD, it was like, oh, I'm really good at change and adapting. But I realized I'm actually really good at it when I'm the one that initiates it. When somebody else, when we have plans and somebody else changes it, my brain glitches, and I'm just like, no. But if I'm the one that initiates it, not a problem. Turn on a dime. Rejections, rejection sensitivity. So fear of criticism or perceived disapproval or criticism. It's a very real thing that a lot of neurodivergent folks experience, whether ADHD, autistic, or both. And masking is huge in the neurodivergent community. So adapting a behavior to try and like appear neurotypical or neurotypical performing, often at the cost of a ton of energy. So how do they differ? Well, ADHD seeks stimulation, so boredom is painful for us. Autism often avoids overstimulation, so too much sensory input. ADHD is impulsive, and often we act quickly. We'll jump on to things. Whereas autistic people tend to be more cautious, think before acting. ADHD craves novelty, newness, unpredictability, chaos, kind of. Autism prefers routine, predictability, knowing what's happening, being able to have a schedule that they can follow. ADHD is easily extracted by external stimuli, which also can happen with autism, with kind of the stimulation, the overstimulation. But with ADHD, it's more like our brains are seeking dopamine, or seeking stimulation. So it's easier kind of for us to be drawn to other things as opposed to being overwhelmed by them and not be able to focus. Autistic people often kind of get deeply absorbed in the internal world, or kind of their interest. Again, not an exact parallel, but there's some. And ADHD is motivation is driven by dopamine and reward. Autism is often driven by structure, clarity, and interest. So again, not exact parallels, not always it's like, well, this is true for this and therefore not true for this. Like there are still a little bit overlaps in some places, but those are some of kind of the big differences. Um, Here's where it gets real fun is, and this is why there's the overlap, which is where it'd be really frustrating, is where they both kind of exist at the same time. So with AuDHD, where you have that kind of the push-pull effect. So ADHD says like, let's do something new. And autism says, nope, change is scary. Don't want to do that. ADHD, needs spontaneity, newness, novelty. Autism craves routine, structure, normalcy, right? Things kind of just being predictable. So kind of that internal tug of war of like, I want to do all the new things, but I also am very overwhelmed by the idea of doing all the new things. ADHD can make masking a bit easier in the sense of like we're a bit more adaptive. It still takes a toll, but kind of in the short term, we tend to be a little bit more adaptive to what's going on in our environment. Whereas autism can kind of make it a bit more exhausting of being like, well, it's the overstimulation is so much, and we really need that routine, which can be hard. And so, it's trying to be your authentic self, but also, really struggling with rejection sensitivity, dysphoria, or RSD can be really hard. ADHD impulsivity and autistic literalness can lead to misunderstandings in relationships. So it's when somebody says, oh, it's raining cats and dogs outside, like we don't think it's actually raining cats and dogs outside, but we will take people at their word. We'll say like if they're like, oh, I'm exhausted. We're like, oh, okay, like you're tired. But then they're like, no, I can still do stuff. And it's like, well, why would you say that if you're, if you're exhausted, right? So, something to kind of take into consideration is, emotional burnout often happens faster due to kind of like the dysregulation and sensory overload. The having the push pull. So not only having to kind of like struggle with your brain around, the ADHD or the autism, it's you're fighting both at the same time. It's you're being pulled to do two conflicting things. which can be really, really hard. It's like, I want to go out, I want to see people, I want to interact. I also want to stay at home. There's all these new shows I really want to see, but at the same time, I'm also like, the thought of trying to watch something new and having to focus and pay attention is exhausting. I just like, I'm going to watch the same show I've seen 100 times. I'm going to watch the same movie I've seen before. Um, even though I want to watch something new, it can be really, really hard, right? I want to try something new. But the idea of trying something and not liking it is like, ooh, that's not great, right? Um, so why is it often missed or misdiagnosed? Well, historically, prior to 2013, which is really only 12 years ago, they were looked at as mutually exclusive. You had one or the other. You didn't have both, right? Um, Diagnostic kind of biases. So ADHD was seen as external, as hyperactive, as bouncing off the walls, as being emotionally reactive. Even though that was taken out of the DSM, it was in there before emotional reactivity. Whereas autism is seen as like missing social cues, being socially withdrawn, kind of the more internal world. Um, so some autistic traits, again, because there's a huge overlap between the two, may be seen as kind of like just ADHD. So, for example, like trouble focusing due to sensory overload rather than attention, right? Which again, sometimes both, right? Um, and often masking, hide symptoms, especially in, I don't love the terminology, but like high functioning adults, because you've learned how to get by. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean that you haven't had your struggles, but from the outside looking in, you look like you're successful, right? Or you're holding it together, when really people have no idea of the struggles of where you are. And then when you tell people like, oh, I'm ADHD or autistic or AuDHD, they're shocked. They're like, oh, I never would have thought, because you seem so put together. So, there's also a gender and racial bias, right? Girls and female identifying folks are often missed or misdiagnosed due to ideas of, how girls are supposed to present in the world. And like, well, you're not bouncing on your seat, so you don't have ADHD. Um, or it's like, it could be due to cultural or racial considerations. Because you don't present in kind of like stereotypical kind of like white northern western ways. So in a lot of kind of Asian, Eastern, kind of uh, Eastern European, she's not Eastern European, but in Asian cultures, women are expected to be more reticent, quieter, kind of more withdrawn, good at like, I mean, these are things that women in typical are expected, but really emphasized in certain Asian countries and cultures. And so, somebody may be autistic, but because they're, low support needs and, they are quiet, they don't make waves, kind of keep themselves very organized, um, may be seen as like, oh, you're just kind of following the, social script, right? So just, again, it's a very, very kind of like basic idea. Young Black men may not be diagnosed with ADHD. They will be diagnosed with like behavioral problems or, their oppositional defiant disorder, as opposed to somebody who may have ADHD and may have the more hyperactive or the more emotional dysregulation. Um, but because of kind of cultural biases and racism, um, that same behavior in a white boy would be caught, would be diagnosed, would be assessed, diagnosed, um, would be overlooked, or would be like, oh no, you're just trying to use that as an excuse to cover up for bad behavior, right? So it's unfortunate that these things happen, but they do, and we need to be aware of them, and we need to take them into account, right? So, what are some common experiences for audition individuals? Feeling too much and not enough at the same time. Difficult fitting into ADHD or autistic communities. Kind of being pulled between two worlds, right? Because again, you have experiences of both, but you also have experiences that don't belong in either of those specific communities. So, kind of feeling adrift. Um, Chronic exhaustion from managing conflicting desires and emotions and thoughts. It's a lot to manage. Um, Honestly, for a lot of us, relief and validation upon discovering that AuDHD exists and that we are part of that community. When I realized that I was also autistic, there definitely was some grief, some shame, some confusion. Be like, well, I'm not what you think of as autistic. Because I mean, I'm in my 40s. I grew up watching Rain Man was my example of like what autism is, right? And then we moved past that, and now we're things like Sheldon Cooper on the Big Bang. I know they say that he's not autistic. That's complete bullshit. He is coded as autistic so hard. Um, uh, Sean Murphy from The Good Doctor, right? But again, the kind of they are perceived or portrayed as like savant syndrome kind of level, right? And there's like most autistic people do not have savant syndrome. Um, so it's just there's this idea of like, does this really fit me? And when you realize that it does, there can often be a sense of relief, sometimes some confusion, and trying to kind of have that internal battle of being like, well, can I really claim this identity? Does this really fit me? Because it doesn't fit the narrative of what society has said, autistic or ADHD or AuDHD people are, right? And honestly, needing kind of like mixed support approaches. So structure and flexibility. I mean, you need that even with ADHD because we need structure. Um, we don't tend to like it. But here's the thing: is that's I always used to think like, oh, I don't like structure and routine. I absolutely hate it. And what I realized was I actually really like structure and routine. I just struggle with implementing it and following through on it. That is my ADHD. But the wanting the comfort of routine and structure is very much my autistic side. Um, but that was buried, and so I thought that I didn't like structure and routine, and I actually really, really do. But it's just very hard for me to implement, which is again, kind of the confusion of being like, well, I thought autistic people were supposed to be really good at structure and routine, and why is it something I struggle with? And it's like, well, because I also have ADHD, right? So that's a kind of perfect example of that push pull. Um, so, what are some strategies that help? Well, routine flexibility. So routines that have wiggle room. So not being so structured that it's like you can't deviate from it. That's really, really hard to do, really hard to implement. But when you're able to do it, it can be really helpful. Sensory planning, so if you're going some places like I have my AirPods on me pretty much all the time. So if I'm very, very misanthonic. So if I go to a place, I can just put my headphones in. Lighting, clothing textures. My daughter is ADHD, not AuDHD, as far as we know. We could figure it later differently in the future. But she hates tags on her clothes, so we take them off. Doesn't tend to bother me, but I don't have rings. I'm married 15 years, and yet I don't wear my wedding ring because I have misplaced it so many times. I love the idea of bracelets and necklaces and rings and all that stuff. I'd love to wear that stuff. I really would. Honestly, I'm kind of a hipster wannabe. I can't stand it. The only reason I do not paint my nails, it's not because I'm against it, not at all. My daughter's painted my nails, and I will chip it off within 5-10 minutes. I cannot stand the feeling of stuff on my hands, on my body. I am just tags doesn't bother me, but anything like that, can't stand it. Right. Um, so another thing is like body doubling for task initiation or co-regulation can be really helpful, especially for emotions. And again, these are things that can be helpful for ADHD folks, for autistic folks. It's not like, well, this only applies to ADHD. Like this applies to all of us. Um, Externalizing structures. So visual planners, whiteboards, reminders. I mean, everything is in my phone. It's just super helpful. We also have the Skylight calendar and app, and that's been really helpful to kind of have things across, across schedules between my wife and I and my daughter and all of her stuff. Um, regulating before reasoning. When somebody is kind of in a heightened state, trying to kind of talk to them and it's not going to help. They're not there. So we need to regulate, and that goes again for everybody, but especially for neurodivergent folks that are kind of in a meltdown or shutdown. Um, Special interest, honestly, lean into it when and where you can, right? I mean, a special interest of mine obviously is mental health, is neurodivergence, and that's I've leaned into this as my job. Um, there's other things, right? So for me, I mean, I like so I have my hobbies. Like with ADHD, we tend to hobby hop, whereas with autism, you tend to kind of like just special interest. So kind of the way that I've gotten around there, the kind of way that's impacted me is um, I have my special interests that I tend to kind of hop around. So fantasy, like reading fantasy, watching it, all that stuff. So fantasy, kickboxing, running, um, video games. And I kind of tend to kind of go back and forth between those, all kind of like really fixate on one for a while, and then I'll kind of hop off and move to something else. So that's kind of how I do that. Um, Gentle accountability. So low pressure reminders instead of kind of rigid schedules or kind of nagging or, just like, hey, you said you're going to do this. Like, hey, what's up? What's going on with this? What's getting in the way? Right? How can I help you? How can I support you? Or what do you need? Um, you know, and honestly, self advocacy, communicating your needs. I know this is exhausting. I know it's tiring. It's so much. And we shouldn't have to. We really shouldn't. But unfortunately, this is the world that we live in. If you're not able to advocate for yourself, sometimes getting somebody that can advocate with you can be really helpful. So I can't count the number of times I've gone into the hospital or doctor's office, and my wife will be there and she'll advocate on my behalf. And she'll remind me to ask and talk about things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of or that I would forget. So, I mean, I'm still capable of advocating for myself, but it also helps that I have somebody there that's able to support me, right? So, um, being AuDHD doesn't have to mean double the struggle. It can sometimes, but it can also mean double the depth, the creativity, the insight, right? As much as there are struggles with being, AuDHD, there are also a lot of strengths that come along with it. I will never advocate that neurodivergence is a superpower. It is a disability, but it's a disability in large part because of the systems and the environments that we live in. And there are advantages to being neurodivergent, but there are also struggles, right? Very few things are black and white. It's usually some sort of nuance, some shade of gray. Um, Many of us are incredibly resourceful because we've had to build lives that work for ourselves. I mean, I've been a social worker for shit, almost 20 years. I've worked in many different areas of the field, and ultimately, I had to create my own business because this is what worked for me. It took me a while to get here, longer than I would have liked, but it's that is like, how can you build a life that makes sense for you and accommodates your needs in all aspects, and what does that look like, right? And that's something that talking to friends, family, therapist can help to provide some perspective or kind of give an overview or kind of help you to work with it. The goal isn't to kind of fix one or the other. It's more to kind of find the harmony between them, because sometimes one is going to be in ascendant and then the other. It's not uncommon for people to have be more dominant with one versus the other. I am on AuDHD, but I am more dominant ADHD than I am autistic. And there are other people that are more dominant autistic than they are ADHD. Doesn't mean that autistic traits don't impact my life. They very much do. Um, but I would say a big part of kind of my neurodivergence is more ADHD focused. And that's fine. But definitely there are times when autism comes along, kind of like, is driving the bus, so to speak. So just understanding how do I create that harmony between both, and understanding that things are going to ebb and shift and flow, and that's okay. What does that look like, right? So if you want to learn more about all things neurodivergent, I encourage you to tune in, to subscribe, follow, like all of my different socials. We're able to work with people virtually within Ontario. If you're in London, Ontario, you can come in and speak to us in person. I would love to hear from you. Miigwech for coming, and I will be here. Actually, I won't be here next week because I will be in Hawaii. But the week after, 2 weeks after, yeah, 2 weeks after, I will be back. So I'm taking a short break, well-deserved break to go on vacation. So until then, we watch, and I'll see you all in a few weeks. Thanks. Bye.